Hi again. My name is Abby Sherlock, and I am one of the co-hosts here for Area of Effect, and this is our game design panel. Reminder that we are still taking donations, as we will be throughout the day for our three causes: Black Girls Code, Direct Relief, and Code 2040. Be sure to check out our link on Tiltify. Our guests today come from a wide range of backgrounds in game production and a multitude of companies within the gaming industry. From current and past work at top AAA studios across the world to beloved indies, we're talking epic entries on their resumes like Halo to The Legend of Zelda, Cadence of Hyrule. We are sitting in the presence of some pretty knockout designers and storytellers. Let's level up and get this thing started. We have some questions on deck for our awesome panelists, but we are also here for audience participation. You can ask your questions for a Q&A session to be answered at the end of the panel by typing !question in Twitch chat, which will bring up a form for you to submit your questions. Those in Discord can be on the lookout for this form and panel announcements. So let's start this off. Can each of you give me a brief summary of who you are, what company you currently work for, and how you especially work in game design? Let's start with Andy.
Hello, I'm Andy Wynn, and I'm a project manager and lead designer at Brace Yourself Games. We're known for Crypt of the Necrodancer and The Legend of Zelda, or Cadence of Hyrule, The Legend of Zelda featuring Crypt of the Necrodancer, which was released on Switch more recently. I'm currently the project manager for Industries of Titan, which is a cyberpunk city building sim strategy game. And as the lead designer, I sort of oversee the direction of where the game is going in terms of gameplay and how the focus of gameplay systems that we should implement.
Deja?
Hi, my name is Deidre Christopher. I am currently at Raven Software. I'm a level designer, and currently working on our main franchise. And yeah, a little bit about me.
CJ.
Hi, I'm CJ Payne. I'm a senior game designer at Bungie, and I work on seasonal content. So each of the seasonal releases that comes out, I do some work there to keep new, fresh content coming in for players and progressions, things like that.
Awesome. And Micah.
Hi, I'm Mika. I am a gameplay designer at 343 Industries. I set up enemy encounters. I kind of adjust how things kind of work and pan out in terms of the gameplay sense. So, yeah.
Awesome. So let's start with Andy. And I'm really curious about this is for all of y'all, and we're going to kind of go in a loop and work our way in that order. But Andy, first, what was your journey like getting into game design?
So that's a kind of a long one. I started I started in 2010. My first job was for a game called Monaco, What's Yours Is Mine. And at the time, I lived in San Diego. So Brace Yourself Games is in Vancouver, Canada, where I live now. But I was born and raised in San Diego, and I did not work in the game industry at the time, but I really wanted to find a way in. And there was a local indie who was looking for people to give feedback on Monaco as it was at the time. And so I responded to that call or that the advertisement for sort of the QA, and then I provided my feedback, and um, the amount of feedback that I gave was detailed to the point where I was hired on for more of a QA role initially. But as the scope of the game expanded, we saw the need for level design and supplemental design. So I started to help provide design for Monaco as well as doing the level design for the game. And at that point, I was one of the two full-time members of that project, and I stayed at that company until 2017, where I moved to Vancouver for Brace Yourself Games.
Very cool. Deidre.
So I started off actually in the education sector. So after studying game design, game development, level design, I started teaching part-time and then full-time. I worked on an indie title called Solar Purge, which is on Steam, which is super cool. And then I was recruited by 343 and I started as a level designer and then moved kind of more into like game design and counter design roles as well. And then now I'm at Raven.
Very cool. CJ.
I, similar to Andy, kind of went indie at first. I just knew I wanted to work on games since I was super young. So I worked on like one indie team doing writing and some like gameplay design. Then moved on to another one because that didn't work out for like a year and a half. Was doing systems design on a
Mm.
tactics-based game, and then that ran out of like funding when we were getting ready for Kickstarter and stuff. Ended up going to school and doing that like 4-year route for a game design degree, and in the middle of there, um, also was able to kick in and get work at Camouflage on Republic, and then from there, that production experience helped me out. I landed a job at Turn 10 doing game design, like for engagement, prototyping, systems design, and now I'm at Bungie.
Very cool. And Mika.
I spun up an indie company with a couple other friends, and we made a few browser games, and that kind of went on for about 4 or 5 years, and then it kind of, as many indie companies do, it kind of burst into flames. And then after that happened, I got hired on at 343 Industries as a level designer, and then I made the transition to gameplay designer a couple of years ago. So
Very cool. So I'm interested, and we're gonna go work our way backwards. So going with Mika starting this time, what influences or other games inspire your personal game design process?
um, hmm.
Right?
Yeah, so many, so many. I think I'm really into games that kind of have minimal tutorialization and things like that. So something that's kind of really influenced me recently has been Outer Wilds and
Mm, yeah.
sort of very mechanics first gameplay designs. So typically titles that really kind of trust the player to kind of make that call, make those decisions for themselves, and sort of explore and figure out the world
Mm,
in their own way and at their own pace. Other huge inspirations have been Rain World has been a big one for me as well as Metroid Prime, Shadow of
ooh,
Colossus, games
yeah.
that kind of immediately jump to mind when you think about a certain kind of narrative framework or gameplay system. So yeah, typically it's games with a very strong identity and a very strong either central narrative message or central mechanic.
Mhm.
Uh, those are the games that kind of speak to me, and that I look to for inspiration in terms of like where I like to take my designs.
Love it. CJ.
My answer might be a little wonky, but
That's okay.
um, skateboarding is actually like pretty influential for
Cool.
me
Yeah.
because I used to do that for like many years and like very seriously. Um, and when it comes to skateboarding, the thing that's kind of wild about it is doing street skating. You aren't looking at like, oh, this is a spot where I go to skate because you're supposed to skate here. You're going to places that you're not meant to skate
Yeah.
a lot of the time. So you're looking at things in a wildly different way than the average person does. You see like a drainage ditch and you're like, oh, I might be able to gap into that. That could look good. Yeah. And you might see like just a ledge in front of a building. And to you, it's just the most perfect thing you've ever seen. So for me, that helps me when I'm just
Mm,
trying to examine things from like a different perspective or point of view. I always try and like second guess my assumptions about like, oh, I know this thing is traditionally used for X maybe in one game, but couldn't it also do like this other thing? So for systems design, I try and take that to narrative a lot.
yeah.
When I'm working with my narrative designers to say, okay, like I have a thing and it's mechanically it's these inputs and it does these outputs, but can
Mm,
we also like put this kind of wrapper on it because that might help deliver like player fantasy a little better. So those help a lot. And then on some of the same notes Mika hit, like when a game executes really well on one thing, like really just like honing in and focusing on that. So like looking at Sekiro for how it handled its combat design, and it really used a like a one of 3 lane systems for dodging, jumping, and its guards. And that feels really well because you know which one you're supposed to do, and each of them has a basic version and a plus up version. So stuff like that.
That makes 100%. And like inspiration comes in the all places. So skateboarding. And I always think of games as this perfect merging of technology and art. And technology is always innovating. And skateboarding is always pushing, boundaries of where you can skate. So that makes so much sense in my mind. Deja.
So it's interesting that you said you feel like game design kind of merges art and technology. So I get a lot of inspiration. I'm an avid reader. Like
Yes.
I read like a book a night. I mean, that's my thing. But also I look, when working as a level designer, I look at architecture. It's not uncommon for me to walk in, like a downtown space and just say, oh, look at this building and look how they made the path here. And, oh, but they've blocked this area. And I sort of gamify everything in my mind. I mean, it's just like, I'm in this room. Where are the exits? Where are the corners? Where are the doors? Is this a good room for a shooter? Or is this more of like an RPG type space? So I'm constantly doing that. But I also really, really enjoy thinking about player psychology, and I think that's really important. And I like to change that. Like, why do we not look up as much as we look forward in games? So I like to play with verticality and that type of stuff as well, kind of like change things up. Because I think that it's just really interesting to find something new. Like the games everybody else has mentioned, they stand out for a reason because they've done something unique and different. And I like to try to do that as well. So
makes so much sense. And Andy.
So I think I spend a lot of my free time when I'm not playing games or working, just consuming like television or movies or anime or like that type of entertainment. And I get a lot of my inspiration from those sources because I think at least the way I've approached sort of developing games is starting with kind of like the fantasy that players have and fantasies are sort of like there's ones that tend to be more popular than others. So Monaco started off with sort of the tropes that you would see in a movie like Ocean's 11 or heist films, which have been around for many, many years now. And you have certain like archetypal characters that behave in certain ways. And so as a designer, it was fun to ask like, how would this personality type of like a George Clooney type person or a Matt Damon type person, how would that translate into a video game? And then with the current work that I'm doing with Industries of Titan, it's heavily inspired by Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, Akira, Cowboy Bebop, and those type of things. And so we start to ask ourselves like, in sort of dystopian visions of the future, trash and garbage tends to be sort of like get out of hand and starts to be part of the aesthetic of the world because the care for the environment starts to is not an issue, or people stop caring for the environment. And so how does that translate into mechanics rather than aesthetics? And so we actually turn that into a gameplay system. And it's all driven by things that people have known for decades now based on their favorite media. And I think what that does is it helps us in multiple ways. One, as I said earlier, it helps inspire us making new gameplay systems that normally we don't see. But two, it also makes it so that when players experience those for the first time, it's really intuitive because they've seen how it works in media. They know how it should work based on the stories that they've played, and then so when it's easy for them to kind of role play that those mechanics.
Awesome. So we're talking about like inspiration and influences before you start the game design process. But one of our questions I think is so interesting. It's like, how do you begin like step one of your individual game design process? So you're inspired, you have all your influences, but usually what's your first thing you do? Andy.
Oh, okay. So just to be clear, the question is once the designer is inspired, like what do I do specifically?
What's your usually step one? Yeah, if you're individualistic, you're like, all right, step one, step two, this is usually how I start.
Oh, okay. So for me, and this has actually been a more recent thing is I started emphasizing documentation a lot. The team for Brace Yourself has grown considerably over the last few years. I think it's like 4 times larger than it was when I started 3 years ago. And so there was a time when, like, when I was working initially at Phonmatico and my game after that, the team sizes were like 2 or 3, and it was really easy to kind of just keep the ideas in the form of conversation. But I've moved on to like documentation and putting the ideas down and really thinking about them in a way that if anybody could pick up this document and understand it by reading it and understand exactly what my intentions are,
Yeah.
then that document has succeeded. But in order for me to create such a document, that I had to actually think about the design like
Yep.
and from many different perspectives, and that I find that to be a pretty fun process.
Deidre.
So I agree with Andy absolutely, especially on large teams. Documentation is really, really important. But I love to just brainstorm on like
Mhm.
whiteboards, like sit down with a group of people and just kind of like go back and forth. So like, what if we do this? And I sort of think in terms of like I like to get in the headspace of the player. So
Mhm.
if I introduce this mechanic, how are they going to think about this? Is this too handholdy? Is this too difficult? How does it relate to the canon of the IP that I'm working on? And how do we move forward with that? How do we make this interesting and unique and different? So there's a lot of whiteboard work. There's a lot of like, my favorite tool, notepad, pen, paper, get those ideas down. It's not uncommon for me to wake up like 4 o'clock in the morning going, this would be an awesome mechanic. I got to
Yeah.
write this down now before I forget it. And then just like going back and forth with the team, talking to other people, like whether it's like my own personal game idea or, one that I'm working on professionally, and
Yeah.
just like, get in there and try to like block something out and just play with it and see how it goes.
Yeah. CJ.
I get a whiteboard. That's my creativity instrument for making things that are just
Yeah.
amorphic into something slightly more concrete. And defining goals. Like I
Ooh,
can't do
yeah.
anything without defining goals. The first thing I'll do, whether
Yeah.
it's like professional work I'm doing, or if it's like side work, I just define like, okay, here is the goals of this specific like
Yes.
thing I'm doing. So I'll lay those out, and then you shoot pie in the sky. You're like, what is the like coolest version of this thing? And you come up with that so that you're like, yes, that is awesome. That is exactly what I would want. And then after that, you look at the reality of the situation. You say, here's what I know how to do or what I don't know how to do. The like teams I would need to get buy-in from, assistance, support. And you lay out your constraints that way, and you work
Yep.
with whoever your partners are on the project to figure out what's doable, what's not doable, what those timeframes will look like. And you try to distill that pie in the sky version down into something that's actually feasible. So that's why the goals are needed first. So you can say,
Yeah.
here's what success looks like. And then here's how we're going to attempt to reach that and the constraints along the way. So it's really about just goals, the perfect version, constraints, then the distillation. And that's where iteration happens.
Yep. Mika.
I can't recommend my process for many other people, but I I love getting in the editor, and if I have the inspiration and the ideas flowing, like I used to go to paper first, and I got so impatient that I just moved directly to whatever editor I'm using, whether it be Unity or Unreal or 343's editor. And I like to try and block out or make a test of something immediately, because for me, when you start doing that a lot, you can kind of identify, you get pretty quick at identifying if the ideas that you're actually having are, if there's any sort of value in there. And I think once you also do that, you can also, you can kind of start jiving off that energy that you get from actually creating the thing and try and harvest that to kind of take it forward. The other benefit of that is that you can also start sharing with your colleagues and kind of speak in more real terms about what this means for them, if this is becomes a real mechanic or this becomes a real layout or whatever. Now this isn't relevant for a lot of design decisions. Like a lot of things just are too large or too complex
Yep.
to actually reflect in any sort of meaningful prototype. But for me, at least, oftentimes the scope of ideas that I'm
Yeah.
dealing with are of a limited size that I can actually represent them fairly quickly in whatever editor that I'm using. So it just really helps my creative process to actually sink my teeth into it and actually just dive in, I guess.
Can I
I-
interrupt?
Yes, please go, CJ.
So I was gonna say everyone I've ever worked with is either like Mika or me, or I'm just like I literally cannot
Yeah.
do anything until I know what my goal is. And even if it's super small, it's just like, oh, I need to make a thing that just does A, and then I can do it.
Mhm.
But it's lovely to see the two types work together, because when both, like, if we were working together and we knew I'm going to do the like type A thing and then Mika's going to do the type B thing,
Mhm.
and then we come together in the middle, it's usually really great because
Yeah.
you have someone who's willing to go and prove stuff out while you're focusing on some of the goals up front. And especially if it's something small scale, it tends to work really well.
Yeah.
100%. It's just so funny because a game design student myself, we're mentioning basically prototyping. We're talking design, experience, and player goals, brainstorming, all these things, and it's just like we're all nailing it on the head from so many angles. So I'm so happy. And y'all mentioned, I heard some different kind of tools and software. So I'm really curious about what do y'all consider the most essential software or tools for game design, or that aspiring game designers should learn. And let's start with Mika.
Well, nowadays I think there's so many options out there
Yeah.
for amateur developers. I know that my kind of tool of choice outside of the editor that I use in work is Unity. I use Unity quite a bit. I can say that a lot of the AAA engines have a lot of similarity with Unreal. So if you're looking for some kind of more similar kind of editing experience, you kind of want to prepare yourself, I think Unreal is a good place to start as far as that goes. I would acquaint yourself with some sort of Visual Studio or some kind of programming thing if that's kind of a track that you're interested in doing. All that stuff is free as well. But yeah, I think GameMaker, Unreal, Unity. There's even sort of kind of smaller engines out there that are even more lightweight that I think I've never tried myself, but I think they're probably worth checking out. But I'd also acquaint yourself with at least some kind of text editor for lightweight scripting and things like that. So yeah.
Very cool. CJ.
I don't think there is a go-to tool.
Mm.
You can make games with pretty much whatever now. There's options, whereas there didn't used to be so many options 10 years ago or even before then. So if you want to use Unity, use Unity. If you want to use Unreal, use Unreal. If you want to go for a smaller engine, GameMaker, Godot, what have you, like all of that works. Twine is also
Yeah,
a really
I love
great
Twine.
start. Like people ignore it all the time, but Twine is very usable and friendly if you're not
Yep.
familiar with
Yep.
doing any code and you're looking at a blueprint system and there's some confusion and you're like just not ready to make that step. Twine's a really like great entry level for just testing the waters. But probably just something like Visual Studio if you're going to go for like a game engine, just because if you're going to need to code, that's pretty much the standard everywhere. You can swap things up, but that's the real thing you will need, because if you're doing art, it could be 2D or 3D to use Photoshop, Paint.net, what have you. But all of them work because I've used some Unreal, I've used some Unity and GameMaker. Like everything works now. Just find something to make a game in.
Do it. Yeah.
Do it. Deja.
So I agree with all those statements.
Yeah.
But I think something else that's really important is like if you choose one of these tools, really get to know it like all the way through. Like as at least when I started out in level design, my courses they didn't teach Unreal Engine 4. And I spent literally anywhere from 8 to 12 hours every single day in that engine. I know it backward, forwards, upside down. And I think that that's really important. And, definitely learn scripting, I think, for game design. And really, you need it a lot of times for level design too. And I think, whether and of course, that's based on the engine, right? Like if you're learning Unity, I think it's like JavaScript, C#.
Yep.
Unreal, C++, learn, other languages like Lua as well. They come in really handy. Python, even Mel, depending on the studio that, you end up at, you may have different scripting languages. And a lot of times, if you understand the concepts, it's more or less just learning, the actual nomenclature of the language.
Mhm.
But I think it's really important because, you'll start looking on job boards and you'll see that a lot of studios
Yep.
want people with scripting. I mean, and it really depends on the type of designer you are as well.
Yes.
But like everyone said so far, all of the engines are great. They're great because they're free. There's good and bad to all of them. You have a lot of free assets in Unity, Unreal. You can do rapid iteration and prototyping just to get in there and
Yep.
just practice and play with things. And I think that that's really important. Just do it, just get
Mhm.
in there and mess with stuff and create something. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like just
No.
get it going, get it running, get it built, send it to somebody. Does it work for them? Do they have the same experience? Get that feedback and iterate on it. And I think that's really important.
Andy.
So yeah, with regards to tools, it's even within Brace Yourself, we have 3 different teams, and one of them uses Unity, and Titan is on Unreal. And
Mhm.
so it'll be inevitable at some point in your career that you'll have to learn a tool that you may not have as much experience with as you probably spent time with. That's if you had learned another tool. So just learning the ability to like get used to the technical requirements of these tools is important. Um, and just to reflect what Deidre said, is like any job these days is going to have at least some experience scripting, which will be
Yep.
like really important. And from my personal experience, since my first 2 games were in XNA, the tools that I had to use were actually just built for that specific game and nothing else. And so like being adaptable is really important. But just to speak to those who maybe don't have that much experience with working with these softwares, I would say that anyone can really get started with game design, even with doing paper prototypes.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
it's actually incredibly difficult to. It's not the hard part about making a paper prototype isn't necessarily putting the game uh, making the game actually work, which is the hard part of learning the engine. But the hard part of is to figure out what is fun about the game and having that fun transfer over to other people who play it, and then also they also have fun. And since there's plenty of board games and card games that are fun, then we
Mhm.
know that we don't necessarily need the engines to actually do this.
Yeah.
And so, but that is the skill as a game designer that you would want to find out how to master. And so I would say the picking up a tool now, you might actually run into a situation where you're struggling with the tool to convey what you have in your mind,
Yep.
and that's frustrating. So
Yes.
why don't we make the tool not the issue, and you start with paper prototypes, so then you can actually figure out how to convey what you have in your mind to other people faster.
I love, so we've been talking about scripting, programming, and engines and all these kind of tools for game design, but I'm also really curious, kind of adjacent to that, but what skills or knowledge areas do you think a game designer should immerse themselves in? And we talked about this kind of previously before even this stream started, because game design as a major in education is still kind of rare, and a lot of game designers come from very diverse different backgrounds. And they all bring something different to the table. So I'm just curious what areas y'all personally think make a strong and a dynamic designer. And let's start with Andy.
So I would say first and foremost for me, it's communication skills. It's actually um, r- I think one of the hardest, most regular types of challenges that I see in my day-to-day job is that there's a concept that we want to convey or from like have from a high level and move it down to the rest of the team, and then that concept doesn't tend to translate accurately.
Mm-hmm.
And so this situation is sort of inevitable, and especially as like companies get larger and larger, there's
Yep.
studios at hundreds of people. There's just going to be this natural fallout of communication,
Mm-hmm.
and so sort of dealing with the natural friction of the communication, and also making sure that the communication is as frictionless as possible. It saves people's time and makes the product better. It's the one thing that I wish I could do perfectly. You know, so I would say to do your best to try to like work on the skills.
Deja.
So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Communication is absolutely vital. If you can't work on a team, it's very difficult to do well in this
Mhm.
industry. The other thing, and this may seem silly, but play games. Play lots of games. Play all kinds of games. Play games that you wouldn't normally play and find out like what they did differently or, why is this game popular? You don't even have to play like AAA games or even indie games. You can go on some of these smaller websites, Congregate, for example, see what other people are doing, play some of these web-based games. What mechanics are they using? Why are they using it? You know, but I also think it's really important as a designer to look at other traditional forms of art.
Mhm.
Like I mentioned before, I love architecture,
Yeah.
but I also get inspiration from, Caravaggio and, uh, Da Vinci. Like there's all kinds of different things that you can get inspiration from,
Yep.
and you can immerse yourself in art. Of course, you can immerse yourself in technology. What's going on in the AR field, or
Yeah.
who's out there doing different types of code, and maybe it's not for games, but why is that interesting? And just kind of immerse yourself in everything, like even psychology. Read. There's so many different paths you can take, but I really do think one of the most important things is play games, and I think that there's a different way of playing games. Like playing as somebody who's just playing a game and enjoying it is very different to playing a game as a designer. Like
Yeah.
walking up, like if you're in like an MMO and there's like a giant cliff. Well, why did they put that there? What's important about that? Look around with your camera, why are these different like hillsides here? Is it to orient the player, or is it to, allude to something else that's, you know, coming up? Look at color theory.
Mm.
Great example is Horizon Zero Dawn. When you see yellow, you can climb, right? You see the color yellow, you can climb up on something. So just study what other people have done in games, and just kind of immerse yourself in that world.
Totally. CJ.
I would say design, like
Mm.
as a broader sense, because there's a reason we're game designers, and hopefully for people, it's not just like a choice to do game design because they like games, but because that's the field of design they want to choose.
Mhm.
There's a lot to take from visual design
Yeah.
and as a very basic level. And I don't mean like UI and UX, but
Mm.
just the art of visual design, which is working with positive and negative space, line, weight,
Mhm.
form, geometric versus organic shapes, and how you make things curvilinear, doing that in like black and white, then doing that in like D with sculptures, attractive, additive. Doing those sort of things help really like train your mind to think about, if I do X, what are the consequences and what are the rules? Because that's really how I kind of look at design, is
Yeah.
creating a structured set of rules and making them felt, and what the impact of that is like emotionally when you are experiencing whatever that piece is. So if each game is like a piece or a project, the design is like all encompassing, right? Start to study um, any other form of design, industrial design, visual design, like I said, architecture, like Deja said, is a really great example. Look at those and then go into design and start to reverse engineer. What are the rules people kind of came up with when they were going for this experience and
Yeah.
trying to make you feel a certain kind of way? And you can do that with just about anything, I think.
Yeah.
And that helps you just understand like the player psychology of who a game is for as well. So you can really just like deep dive into like rules in total, because that's the first thing you need to learn how to do as a designer. If you want paper prototype, come up with the rules, and then you need to come up with how you communicate the rules, and then you come up with how someone will actually experience those rules.
All very important. And Mika.
Yeah, I think all the big points have kind of been hit already, but I think
Yeah.
design is sort of special because I at least at 343 it kind of sits at the center of a lot of other different
Yeah.
disciplines, and so I found it's very helpful to familiarize yourself with the rule sets and the desires of these other of audio, of art, of narrative, and kind of familiarize yourself with the struggles that they're facing and kind of what they're trying to get out of um, this experience. Because once you can kind of commiserate with their
Mhm.
goals and try and empathize, it kind of all flows uh, through design in a sense. Not to kind of inflate my sense of over like self-importance here, but like um, so understanding how audio wants to kind of achieve their goals, and helping them kind of understand what's possible in that space. um, you know Looking at art and looking at the struggles and the kind of difficulties that they face and trying to work around that. I think that ability to um, facilitate other people's ideas from different departments has really kind of enhanced my own understanding and my way to kind of commit my own ideas onto the space. Because at the end of the day, games are like this very holistic product of all these other disciplines. So um, I found that being able, like, talking with these people, I think
Mhm.
Andy's point of communication is essential. I think being able to talk with other people, trying to get out what they're trying to communicate, and um, yeah, I just think communication is the cornerstone, and being able to kind of being compassionate about
Mm.
other industries and other disciplines.
Very important. And that kind of leads literally into my next question, which I think is kind of like a spicy topic in game development. So I'm super curious to hear what y'all think. But level design, combat design, narrative design are technically all, under this umbrella of game design. What do you think about the classifications of what a game developer or a game designer is? And let's start with Mika.
I think this changes depending on what studio you're working for.
Mm,
I
yeah.
do know that this, like, at a lot of places, level design includes both sort of the layout of the space, but also encounter work.
Yes.
Whereas, like, at 343, and I think I can talk about this, level design and gameplay design are two different things. So there's the level designer who goes in and, in fact, I've worked with Daedra on this before, but like level design goes in, they create the space. It's a very communication. It's a very collaborative effort between the game designer and the level designer. We talk a lot. We share ideas. We share concepts. Level designer goes in, makes the space. And then gameplay designer goes in, sets up all the systems, opens, closes the doors, brings in all the gameplay elements, and then that kind of kicks off this back and forth that happens for as long as we have time for before art and audio need to get in there to
Yep.
actually do that thing. So I think, to answer the question, I think it's flexible. I think it depends on where you're working, but I think for people looking to kind of get into the industry, it would behoove you to um, kind of think about the specifics as to what you want to do, whether you just love creating spaces, or whether you like crafting the perfect combat encounter, or if you
Yep.
like making systems
Yep.
or progressions, or whatever. I
Oh,
think
wait a minute.
there are roles that kind of tackle all that
I
stuff,
can
but
hear
a lot of other
myself.
places are very more focused, and that tends to be the larger the studio. I think that's when things become a little bit more specific. So. Uh, Yeah, I think that's kind of my semi cop out answers. It depends, but on the place that you're working. But I think yeah, yeah, that's all I got.
Very valid. CJ.
So the question is like, what do I think
Yeah.
about the classifications? I don't know, because I don't think I can say anything meaningful about it. It's like,
Uh,
yeah, we're all game designers. There's different classifications that studios have. You might have a level designer, encounter designer, and an activity designer. And across
Mm,
all three of those different kinds, they might share a third to 75% of the same work, depending on where you're at. So you just look at the job description and you're like, okay, I know what's up here because I can see that. I talk with them, get it. If I'm like going to interview for somewhere else and they can see what's there, that's cool. That's like almost about all I feel about it
Yeah.
otherwise, because there's design shared in, like, whether I'm a narrative designer, technical
Yeah.
designer, systems designer, gameplay designer, level designer, behavior designer, social designer, you're
Oh,
all working
yeah.
on the rules of X. It's like whether it's the
Mm,
rules of how I traverse the environment, the rules of how
yeah.
like you lay out your gameplay verbs, and like what adjectives someone might throw on top of them.
Mm,
So yeah, they exist. I can mostly tell what things are.
yeah.
Eh.
Great unifying factor about that. How X Y's with rules. I think that makes a lot of sense. Deja.
So I agree with both Mika and CJ. I think like if I were to answer this question like in terms of how maybe students or people wanting to get into the industry
Mm-hmm.
should sort of focus their energy, like I
Yeah.
think it's really important to have like a strong focus at first.
Yeah.
But whether you're on an indie team, well, if you're on a smaller team, you're going to wear all kinds of hats, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like you're going to get into, you may do mission design, you may do narrative design. You may have been hired as a level designer, but you may end up finding that, you do like everyone else has mentioned, a little bit of everything. Um but again, like CJ said, the importance of the rules and what defines the game are still going to be your driving force. And even in larger studios like that do tend to be more granular on like who does what, there's still going to be some crossover. And I think the most important thing to take from this question and why it's kind of a difficult question is that
Yeah.
game development is a team sport. Like
Yes.
everybody pitches in, and and unless everybody pitches in and kind of like gives their assistance, it's hard to make a really good game.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that, it's you're gonna wear a lot of hats. You may start off wearing like a beret, but by the end of it, you may, switch from a beret to a bowler. Like that's just the way it is. So yeah.
I love that. And Andy.
Yeah, I agree with everyone, and it's weird. I've only ever been indie in my career, and so I'm aware of these separations of fields, but in the at least in the teams that I've talked to, other indie teams and the teams I've been on, it's never really been something that we have chosen to specialize in. But the game itself actually will tend to lend itself to one type of thing over another. So if you're making like a simulation strategy game, it's going to be very systems driven. If you're making a narrative game like uh, then it's going to have more narrative design, and that tends to be just driven by the type of indie game that's being made. But if you're on a larger AAA uh, larger AAA project, I imagine that there's going to be the need for all of that, and there's going to be lots of specialists on for that. So I'm not. I guess if I were to give advice for anyone, it actually would be something that like I would think about, which is are you shooting for AAA or are you shooting for indie?
Yes.
Because it kind of requires a different mindset. And if you are planning on, but or I can, if I'm going to speak for at least in my indie experience, if you're planning on doing indie, be open to trying and doing all of them, because that'll just increase your chances of the types of projects that you can work on. Because there are indie games, tons of indie games with no combat whatsoever. So a combat designer makes absolutely no sense on those
Exactly.
projects.
Yeah, that's a super good point. We are officially going to move into our Q&A audience session of the panel. I also have to interrupt and shout out that we have officially reached over $1,000 raised for each of our 3 charities.
Yay.
Oh, yay. Okay. Awesome hype moment categorized. Okay, so now this first question from our Q&A basically is a really interesting and kind of story-based one, but it is what is one of the most difficult challenges for game design? What was the hardest thing you personally as a game designer had to do within the industry? So let's start with Andy.
Okay.
I know it's a big
Well, so I think so. Just I've been saying this. I've only really a bulk of my experience has been on smaller teams, and when it comes down to smaller team sizes, I think that design or what the design of the indie game should be
Mhm.
can come down to a select few people. And that makes the conversations a lot harder if there's a difference of opinion. There's no like structure for how the design should go or what it should be. And I think earlier in my career, what was really hard was balancing the idea of being passionate about something, like really believing in an idea, but also that tends to mean that is sort of immovable in terms of conversation with that particular idea. So it's hard. It's hard. It's just like part of the job, and so. That's just kind of the one that comes off the top of my head right now.
Very cool. And Deja.
So the biggest challenge I've found is coming up with creative or really imaginative ideas that can technically be implemented within a certain time frame, and with the constraints of whatever engine you're working with. I think that that's something, it's like I want unicorns that are, flying out of the sky right now with rainbow tails. No, in all seriousness, just coming up with really awesome ideas. And then, it can be frustrating to say, our engine can't handle that. We can't do this, or we can't do this now, because you do get really passionate about the ideas that you want to implement. And, and you want to bring out something new and interesting. So I think sometimes like some of the technical constraints can, be a little difficult.
Makes total sense. CJ.
This is difficult. It's a
Right?
toss-up. So I think non-professionally, most difficult is like just changing a project's direction from here to over there. And like realizing at a certain point, oh, we can't ship this thing because we don't have enough time, we don't have enough resources, or like overscoped. And how do I keep the work that all of our team has made so far change direction and give it somewhere we can land that's new and get everyone on board for that? Like that's the hardest thing non-professionally, because it's a matter of morale
Yes.
for everyone, because you want to like, oh, I want to keep all of your stuff. Like if I screwed something up here in like project management, I'm going to own that so we can get rid of some of the things I might have planned. So that's difficult. And then the other one I would say is on a communication end, like getting people's buy-in professionally on like very risky thing. Which is fun, because if you're in the indie space and you're doing that, you're always trying something a little risky, because that's kind of what you're buying into going into that space, and it's fun. But in AAA, when you're like, hey, so we set up these goals and they're kind of really abstract, so I'd like to tackle it from this angle, because as a designer, I want to do what other people haven't done before. I want to create something that's new, and I want to like really push genre in some form. So getting people to buy in on that can be very challenging when you're talking to like studio directors and like project leads.
Totally. Mika.
I think kind of to echo what everyone else is saying, but I think for me it's the danger of being too precious about your designs and kind of pearl clutching them.
Yeah.
I know that in any development, sometimes you have this idea and you absolutely love it and you think it's the greatest idea in the world, and then you go out and you implement it and you
To
test
mute
it and
until
get
you
people to
move me
play
over,
it,
and then I will unmute
and
in
it doesn't go
Discord.
quite as
Leave
as how you
Zoom's
want. And it's
muted.
very,
Yeah.
at least for me, it's very kind of appealing to just sort of say to yourself, like, well, maybe they didn't get it. Maybe I just didn't implement it well enough. Maybe I didn't, if I just tweak it a little bit in these ways, I can get it to work. And sometimes you're just working with spoiled goods. And sometimes the best thing to do is kind of take a step back, look at your thing, look at truly what's the problem with it, and just if it's too poisonous, just dropping it. But we all, as a designer, I think you're you have to be passionate. You're going to be passionate about what you make, and being able to separate yourself from that passion and acknowledge when maybe you failed or maybe your design just isn't quite hitting those marks, and listening to the people around you. because it can be hard. You invest dozens, hundreds of hours into these
Yep.
concepts, even still, and maybe it's just not destined to be. So I
Yep.
think learning to distance yourself from your work, learning to kind of know when to call it,
Yeah.
is something that I would recommend people get used to, because there's not an exact science in game design.
No.
There's no one rule book that you can read to make a great game. And you're gonna fail. You're
Yes.
gonna mess up. You're gonna make some bad designs, and they're gonna suck. So being willing and able to move on without any remorse is one of the harder things that I've kind of had to learn.
100%. That developing that self-awareness to being able to know when to kill your darlings.
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly.
yeah, so important. And also I heard morale, so like a really good games producer of your designers, like also so important. A lot of really important stuff. Our final Q&A audience question, which is a very fun one, but it is, what is your specific favorite design element from a game and why? Could be a mechanic, a level layout, a character, rules, etc. And let us start with Mika.
Um, I think probably the being specific in this case, I think in
Yeah.
Outer Wilds, there's a camera that you can fire off, and then you can
Hmm.
look through the camera. And without spoiling anything, because the beauty of that game is figuring out these systems for yourself. But
Yeah.
um, you think it's just for scouting, like it kind of initially comes up as like this is just a tool for kind of investigating a new area
Mhm.
or whatever. But as the game progresses, you kind of naturally learn how to use this mechanic in a variety of different ways, new, surprising, crazy ways. And I think I love that. Some of my favorite games take a very humble mechanic from the beginning that has seemingly one only very obvious function, and then they kind of over the course of the experience they expand it into being this you know a far cry from what is originally intended to be. And so yeah, I'd probably say the I don't know what it's technically called in the game, but the camera drone or orb or whatever from Outer Wilds is a really, really great example of taking a simple mechanic and stretching it in a bunch of really, really fun and unique ways.
Of CJ.
I'd say my favorite mechanic from a game is probably like holding Yorda's hand in Eco. Um,
Mm.
it's one of those things where like Fumito Ueda's design process and iteration is
Yeah.
like throw everything in the truck and then along the ride dump stuff out. So it starts really complex and then he distills things, kind of like I was talking about earlier, where you sky in the pie and or pie in the sky, and then you're like, okay, what do I have left? These things work out. And that mechanic specifically is amazing because you just holding yours hand, it gives you a subtle vibration on the controller. And like it's something we take for granted now, but
Yeah.
back then no one else did that. Like
Yep.
absolutely no one. So every step you take, you feel the vibration from like both of you walking and moving. Um, so as you're going through and you're like doing combat and trying to prevent like the shadow creatures from taking her, you feel like that connection. It helps humanize a character
Yes.
in a way that games typically don't do. And to me, that's such an interesting and underutilized component to game design, especially for something that's so sparse in terms of mechanics. So that one stands out as really strong for me.
Definitely, definitely. Deidre.
So I think for me, um, I just love the pacing and the flow of Horizon Zero Dawn.
Mm.
Like as you never feel like, I mean, well, of course it's an RPG. You never feel like, oh, I've just got to go find this person and do this thing. There's so many different NPCs that just kind of come up naturally, and like when you move into a space, like the different little areas of the game, it just flows so naturally in the world that it just becomes so immersive for me. So the story itself just kind of unfolds. It's almost like reading a book. Um,
Mm.
and it just feels like whatever choice you make is the right choice. It's the natural choice to make. So I think that's probably one of my favorites.
And Andy. Oh, Andy. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah,
Go.
this one's hard. I keep trying to think of something really cool like everyone else here had to say, but the first one that actually came to my mind is really simple, and it's something that all three of their games have, and it's just regenerating health. And and I like it because it made shooters really good. And I mean, I think that it says something that all the games that everyone here worked on has it. I think it like there's like a couple things that I could take out of it. It's like you could remove the HP element from the HUD and you can make it so it's more about like the vignette or like the screen effects, and so the game's more immersive. You don't have to find like medkits, which is not like part of what the fantasy of being a hero is like
Yeah,
the fantasy is you should stay in combat. And then it's really good for like pacing and stuff too, because
totally.
like so and it's really simple, and I think a lot of people probably these days just think that shooters were always that way. But I grew up playing like looking for medkits and stuff, and
I love that. Well, we have officially reached the end of our panel, but before we go, I would love if each of y'all could either shout out your social media if you're comfortable with people following you and maybe asking questions or just seeing what you're up to, or anything else you want to shout out. Let's start with Andy.
so if you do want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter is at pronounced win, WIN, so it's like the word pronounced. And then the Industries Titan, which is the game that I'm working on, is at Industries Game. And then there's also at BYG_Vancouver for the Brace Yourself Games Vancouver.
And Daedra.
So you can follow me on Twitter. It's Daedra and then Christoph, because there weren't enough characters. You can also, if you want to find me on LinkedIn, ask me questions, feel free. Yeah. So
CJ.
You can find me on Twitter at that CJ Payne. Yeah, if you have very specific questions or you're, looking for more along your journey, how to get to where you want to be, LinkedIn probably also a great place you can find me. And then the Destiny shout out, Beyond Light just came out, so if you feel like playing a shooter, go for it.
Good. And Mika.
I don't actually have any social media accounts, so I guess I do have a LinkedIn. If you have any questions, you can hit me up there. I suppose follow the Halo Infinite Twitter account. I suppose. But yeah.
Love it. Well, a huge round of applause and thank you so much. So much large gratitude to these amazing panelists, amazing game designers for taking time out of their day to educate us and geek out over some really cool, very neat concepts. We are going to go to a short commercial break, and when we come back, we will have our deep dive with Dr. Bean going over geek therapeutics. But before we go, a quick shout out to our partners. Twitch Student. Twitch Student offers the means to grow an even larger audience, represent your university on Twitch, and gain skills and experience valuable to a future in gaming. Geek Therapeutics, the leader and gold standard in teaching professionals, parents, students, and others about geek therapy. And Leyline. Leyline is a nonprofit creating a digital economy that rewards people for contributing to causes they care about. Leyline connects users to causes they care about, rewarding them for doing good in the world and supporting the fights against poverty, climate change, cancer, and more. And also a reminder, we have reached over $1,000 for each of our charities this past weekend. So please keep donating until we reach the end of the day. We are doing so much great good work in this world, and we're so proud here at the AOV team of everyone for all the cool work they're doing. And we will be back after a very quick commercial break. Bye.